Beloved, hear this carefully. Prayer was never meant to be a struggle. It was never designed to be a desperate cry shouted into the heavens, hoping God might notice you. Yet this is exactly how many approach Him. Words tumble out, long and heavy, filled with fear, doubt, and begging, as though God must be convinced to act. Jesus saw this error clearly, and He stopped it firmly, because powerless prayer produces powerless lives. When Jesus spoke about prayer, He did not give a formula to impress God. He revealed a way of speaking that carried confidence, clarity, and authority. He exposed a mistake so common that it feels normal, yet so damaging that it silences faith. Many are saying the right words with the wrong heart, and expecting heaven to respond. But heaven does not move at the sound of desperation, it moves at the voice of faith. Prayer was never intended to be a performance staged before heaven, nor a ritual measured by how many words are spoken, or how long the knees remain on the floor. From the beginning, prayer was designed as a living exchange between God and man, rooted in alignment rather than effort, authority rather than anxiety, and truth rather than technique. When prayer turns into repetition without revelation, it loses its power. Jesus directly confronted this tendency, because He knew that speaking many words does not move God. But speaking from a heart aligned with Him releases heaven's order into the earth. Many people pray as though God is distant, reluctant, or unaware, and so they feel compelled to explain, persuade, and even pressure Him with endless phrases. This is not faith, it is fear disguised as devotion. Jesus made it clear that the Father already knows what is needed before a word is spoken. That single truth dismantles the idea that prayer works through verbal labor. If God already knows, then prayer is not about informing Him, and if He is already willing, then prayer is not about convincing Him. Prayer, therefore, must be something higher, something purer, something grounded in relationship rather than effort. Alignment means coming into agreement with what God already is, already wills, and already has spoken. When a man or woman prays from alignment, they are not trying to create something new in heaven, they are giving voice to what heaven has already established. Jesus did not pray hoping the Father would act. He prayed knowing the Father was acting through Him. This is why His words were calm, direct, and final. There was no strain in His voice because there was no strain in His belief. He understood that authority does not shout and faith does not panic. Repetition often replaces trust when confidence is absent. People repeat what they do not believe has been heard the first time. Jesus addressed this not to restrict prayer, but to restore it to its rightful place. When prayer becomes mechanical, the heart disengages, and when the heart disengages, faith weakens. True prayer flows from an inner knowing, not an outer obligation. It is the expression of unity with God, not a method to gain His attention. Alignment produces rest, and rest produces clarity, and clarity produces authority in speech. Performance-based prayer subtly places the focus on the person praying rather than the God being addressed. It measures effectiveness by emotion, volume, or duration, and in doing so, it shifts prayer away from faith and into self-awareness. Jesus removed this burden by revealing that prayer is not evaluated by heaven the way it is often evaluated by people. God does not respond to spiritual theatrics. He responds to truth spoken in faith. A single sentence spoken in alignment carries more power than hours of anxious repetition. Authority in prayer does not come from confidence in words, but confidence in relationship. Jesus prayed as a son, not as a servant trying to earn favor. This distinction is crucial. A servant begs, a son speaks. A servant hopes, a son knows. When believers pray from identity rather than insecurity, their language changes. Fear-driven phrases fall away and faith-filled declarations take their place. Alignment restores identity, and identity reshapes communication with God. Jesus exposed that prayer fails when it is disconnected from trust. Repetition is often an attempt to compensate for doubt. But faith does not need reinforcement through noise. It stands firm in quiet certainty. Alignment aligns the heart with God's nature, and when the heart is aligned, the mouth speaks with authority. This is why Jesus could command storms, address sickness, and speak to death itself without strain. His prayers were not attempts, they were expressions of divine agreement. Prayer rooted in alignment also transforms the one praying. Instead of leaving prayer exhausted, they rise strengthened. Instead of confusion, there is clarity. Instead of fear, there is peace. This is because alignment does not wrestle with God, it rests in Him. Jesus never taught prayer as a struggle upward, but as a flow outward from union with the Father. When this truth is understood, prayer ceases to be a burden and becomes a channel. The mistake Jesus warned against was not passion or persistence, but empty repetition devoid of faith. Persistence is powerful when it is anchored in belief, but repetition without alignment only reinforces doubt. Jesus wanted people to pray with intention, understanding, and confidence, knowing that God is not moved by effort but by faith. Alignment brings the believer into harmony with God's will, and in that harmony words carry weight. When prayer is aligned, it is no longer about getting God to agree with man, but man agreeing with God. This shift changes everything. The tone of prayer becomes assured, the content becomes precise, the heart becomes settled, and from that place, prayer becomes what it was always meant to be. A divine exchange where heaven's reality is spoken into earthly circumstances through faith, filled words that flow naturally from union rather than obligation. Jesus addressed the way many approach prayer, because he understood that so much of it was rooted in misunderstanding rather than in truth. The correction he offered was not meant to restrict communication with God, but to liberate humanity from powerless habits that had crept into spiritual practice over centuries. People were praying, yet not seeing results. They were speaking, yet not experiencing breakthrough. He saw that the error was not in the desire to connect with the Father, but in the method and mindset behind that connection. When prayer becomes a habit of empty repetition, self-focused pleas, or ritualized speech, it loses its transformative power and becomes a shadow of the life it was intended to release. Jesus wanted prayer to be an instrument of authority, faith, and relationship, not a display of neediness or a ritual of uncertainty. Many believers pray with a sense of urgency born of fear, as though God is distant or reluctant, as though heaven requires convincing. This is exactly the mistake Jesus sought to correct. He revealed that God is not persuaded by frantic words, nor impressed by lengthy recitations, nor swayed by emotional intensity alone. Heaven operates on principles of alignment, authority, and truth, and prayer must mirror these principles to be effective. Jesus' correction was revolutionary, because it shifted focus from performance to relationship. The words themselves are not meaningless, but their effectiveness depends entirely on the heart and identity from which they are spoken. When prayer is rooted in misunderstanding, it becomes a cycle of effort without impact, hope without fulfillment, and devotion without results. He demonstrated a way to pray that centered not on what the person needed to say to God to get results, but on what God was already willing to do through his nature and promises. Many prayers fail because they are directed from the perspective of lack, limitation, and uncertainty. Jesus taught that prayer is most powerful when it is spoken from a place of recognition of God's authority and alignment with his will. This was the correction. He offered prayer as not a tool to make God act, but a channel through which believers recognize, declare, and co-operate with what God has already ordained. In other words, it is not about persuading God, but about positioning oneself to move with him. The mistake Jesus observed is so common that it feels normal to most believers. People pray asking, pleading, and bargaining, often repeating phrases without understanding or faith. The repetition, while seemingly spiritual, often reflects a lack of confidence that God has heard or will act. Jesus' teaching dismantled this misconception. He showed that prayer's power comes not from quantity or eloquence, but from clarity, faith, and identity. The difference between ineffective and effective prayer lies in this subtle but profound shift, understanding that God is already at work and that prayer is the declaration of alignment with that work. When prayer is misdirected, it burdens the believer. Repetition without faith creates fatigue. Uncertainty without confidence breeds frustration. Speaking without understanding produces anxiety. Jesus corrected this approach because he wanted prayer to release strength rather than drain it. He wanted believers to experience power, not struggle, results, not emptiness, life, not ritual. The correction was simple in concept but radical in application. Speak from recognition, not desperation. Pray from authority, not uncertainty. Align your heart with God's will, not simply repeat words. Jesus' own example shows how prayer works when corrected. He prayed with simplicity, boldness, and certainty. He did not embellish, over-explain, or dramatize. He spoke as one confident in his identity as the Son, fully aware of the Father's will, fully aligned with divine purpose. His words were precise, not abundant. They were powerful, not performative. When he corrected the habits of ineffective prayer, he demonstrated that the problem was never God's willingness to act, but human misunderstanding of the relationship, authority, and faith required to see results. The reason this correction matters today is that the same patterns of misunderstanding continue in modern practice. Many believers still approach God as if he is distant, unknowing, or hesitant. They still repeat phrases without conviction, and they still hope for results through effort rather than faith. Jesus' correction remains relevant because it redirects the focus. Prayer is not about convincing God. It is about recognizing and participating in what He is already doing. Prayer becomes a declaration, a co-laboring with divine intention, and a means to express faith rather than doubt. This correction also elevates the spiritual life of the believer. When prayer is understood as a declaration rather than a request, faith grows, hope strengthens, and confidence in God's character deepens. The believer begins to pray with authority, understanding that words spoken in alignment with God's will carry impact. It is not the act of speaking that moves heaven, but the recognition of God's power and promises, spoken in faith. This is why Jesus addressed this mistake, to shift the paradigm of prayer from fear and effort to faith and alignment. In practical terms, the correction means that the believer must examine the heart behind the words. Are the words being spoken to inform God, or to align oneself with God? Are they born of doubt, or of certainty in His promises? Are they attempts to persuade, or declarations of faith? The mistake Jesus corrected is subtle but pervasive, and it is the difference between powerless repetition and life-changing prayer. Those who understand this principle approach prayer differently. They approach with expectation, with recognition, and with authority. They no longer see prayer as a struggle to get results, but as an expression of their identity and relationship with God. Jesus' correction of prayer was a profound teaching in authority and relationship. It reminded believers that heaven is not moved by repetition, fear, or uncertainty, but by faith, alignment, and recognition. The common habit of powerless, ritualistic prayer is replaced by prayer that carries weight, direction, and effect. Believers learn to speak from confidence, not anxiety, to pray from truth, not fear, to declare from identity, not need. This correction transforms the act of praying into a powerful channel for the manifestation of God's promises, ensuring that the prayers spoken are not merely words, but instruments of divine impact. Many prayers fail not because God does not hear or because heaven is reluctant, but because they are spoken from a place of need rather than identity. The distinction is subtle, yet it carries profound consequences. When believers pray primarily from need, their words are filled with desperation, uncertainty, and often pleading. The energy behind these prayers is focused on asking God to provide, rescue, or intervene on the basis of what the person lacks. This creates a dynamic where the believer positions themselves as powerless and God as distant or requiring persuasion. Jesus observed this pattern and taught that prayer is not about convincing God to act, but about stepping into the authority, identity, and position that God has already granted through relationship. The heart of prayer, therefore, is not need-driven, but identity-driven, and this shift transforms the effectiveness and outcome of every spoken word. Praying from need places the focus on deficiency rather than on the sufficiency of God. When one constantly articulates what is missing, the words reflect limitation, and the spirit absorbs limitation. The mind becomes conditioned to dwell on scarcity rather than abundance, and the voice articulates fear instead of faith. This is the very mistake Jesus sought to correct, demonstrating that a believer's authority is rooted in who they are in Christ, not in what they lack or hope to receive. Identity-driven prayer acknowledges the resources, power, and promises already available through God. It recognizes that the believer is positioned in Christ with access to divine authority and the fullness of spiritual inheritance, and it allows faith to flow from recognition rather than supplication. The power of identity-based prayer is found in the believer's understanding of who they are in relation to God. When a person prays from identity, they speak with confidence because they are aware of their status as children of God, co-heirs with Christ, and recipients of His promises. They are not asking God to make them something they are not. They are declaring what God has already made them. This realization transforms prayer from an act of need to an expression of authority. Whereas need-driven prayer carries uncertainty, identity-driven prayer carries certainty. Whereas need-driven prayer carries doubt, identity-driven prayer carries boldness. This is why Jesus emphasized the importance of teaching people to pray from position rather than from lack. When a believer prays from need, they often include fear, hesitation, and repetition. The words are meant to convince or persuade rather than to declare and receive. Such prayers, while heartfelt, are limited in their spiritual effectiveness because they communicate a mindset of insufficiency to the very source of power. On the other hand, identity-driven prayer communicates confidence in God's will, alignment with His promises, and awareness of one's authority as a child of God. It asserts what is already true, bringing heaven's power into the present rather than begging for its intervention. This approach shifts the spiritual dynamic. The believer speaks from a place of authority, and the spiritual realm responds accordingly. Jesus' teaching illustrates that prayer is an act of speaking what aligns with God's nature, rather than what aligns with human desire. Many individuals focus so heavily on their needs that they miss the realization that God has already provided through His Word, His promises, and His Spirit. When prayer originates in identity, the speaker's confidence in God's provision transforms the atmosphere. Words spoken in alignment with who one is in Christ carry weight and create results, whereas words spoken from lack often return empty, because they reflect an internal disbelief in the very promises they invoke. The transition from need to identity is therefore central to powerful prayer. Praying from identity also changes the believer's perception of challenges and opposition. Need-driven prayer tends to amplify the problem, making it larger and more intimidating because the person sees themselves as insufficient. Identity-driven prayer sees the same challenge through the lens of divine authority, recognizing that obstacles have already been overcome in principle through the power and promises of God. Jesus modeled this when He faced opposition, sickness, and spiritual attacks. He prayed not from need, pleading for relief, but from identity, declaring what was already accomplished through His relationship with the Father. The result was a demonstration of supernatural authority, rather than human supplication. The mindset of praying from need creates a dependency on God, as though He is distant and waiting to be persuaded. While God is perfectly able to respond to sincere petitions, He does not require repetition or pressure. Identity-driven prayer acknowledges God's nearness and willingness, reflecting a mature understanding of spiritual authority. It communicates recognition of divine truth, rather than attempts to manufacture a response. This approach frees the believer from anxious and laborious prayers, replacing them with declarations and expressions of faith that carry power in the spiritual realm. Jesus' teaching consistently focused on this principle. Effective prayer is birthed from the believer's awareness of their identity, not their insufficiency. When prayers are need-focused, the heart often carries a hidden message of doubt, lack, and fear. The repetition, intensity, and urgency may disguise this message, but the spiritual realm discerns the underlying sentiment. Identity-driven prayer, however, communicates confidence, alignment, and authority. It acknowledges God as Father, Himself as child, and heaven's resources as accessible. The energy behind these prayers is entirely different. It flows from faith rather than anxiety, from recognition rather than desperation. This is why Jesus repeatedly emphasized the need to teach believers how to pray correctly, highlighting that the posture of the heart is more important than the volume or quantity of words. Jesus' correction of need-driven prayer also transforms the way believers perceive answered prayer. When prayer is identity-based, results are not sought with hesitation or uncertainty. The believer expects and declares that what God has promised will manifest. Need-driven prayer often carries the mental picture of absence, lack, or delay, which limits the believer's faith. Identity-based prayer carries the mental picture of already accomplished truth. This changes the atmosphere, aligns the heart with God's purposes, and opens the door for supernatural manifestation. Understanding prayer from the perspective of identity also builds resilience in spiritual life. Challenges, trials, and unanswered situations no longer shake the believer, because the foundation of prayer is not rooted in current circumstances, but in eternal truth. Words spoken in faith declare what God has already established. Faith is not wishful thinking, it is confident recognition of reality beyond the visible. This principle, emphasized by Jesus, corrects the tendency to pray from need, showing believers that the authority of their identity is more powerful than any circumstance, limitation, or opposition. Identity-driven prayer reshapes the believer's relationship with God. Instead of approaching with uncertainty, doubt, or anxiety, the believer approaches with boldness, confidence, and certainty. Instead of trying to persuade God, they declare what is already true. The tone of prayer transforms from begging to proclaiming. The energy behind the prayer moves from insecurity to authority. The results flow not from effort or repetition, but from alignment with divine will and recognition of spiritual inheritance. Jesus taught this principle repeatedly, demonstrating through life example and instruction that the power of prayer is unlocked when the believer prays from identity rather than need. This understanding also frees believers from a lifetime of ineffective prayers. Instead of asking, hoping, and repeating, they begin to declare, recognize, and act in faith. Their prayers become instruments of authority, channels of divine alignment, and vehicles of spiritual manifestation. The correction Jesus offered was revolutionary because it shifted the paradigm from desperation to confidence, from deficiency to identity, and from uncertainty to authority. Believers who embrace this principle discover that prayer ceases to be an exhausting activity and becomes a natural expression of their position, power, and relationship with God. God does not respond to fear, hesitation, or uncertainty, and yet countless prayers are offered with trembling voices, anxious hearts, and doubtful minds. This is the profound truth that Jesus sought to reveal. Prayer is not a bargaining session in which heaven is swayed by persistence, emotion, or desperation. Many believers pray as though they must convince God to act, as though their words hold the power to persuade the Creator of the universe. But the reality is far different. God responds to faith-filled recognition, not fearful pleading. Recognition is the acknowledgement of who God is, what He has promised, and who the believer is in relationship to Him. Faith-filled recognition carries authority, clarity, and certainty, and it releases spiritual power that trembling, uncertain words cannot achieve. Jesus taught that prayer's effectiveness is determined not by quantity of words or intensity of emotion, but by the posture of the heart, the conviction of faith, and the alignment of the believer with God's promises and nature. When prayers are filled with fear, the energy behind the words communicates weakness rather than authority. Fear undermines confidence, and confidence is the currency of effective prayer. A fearful prayer reflects doubt in God's power, doubt in His willingness, doubt in the reality of His promises. Such doubt creates distance between the believer and the divine, even when the words themselves sound righteous. Jesus corrected this by showing that the believer's authority is not in the words, but in the spirit from which they are spoken. Faith-filled recognition acknowledges that God is always present, always willing, and always able. It shifts the perspective from, "Please help me," to "I stand in the promises of God, and I declare them in alignment with His will." Recognition in prayer is more than mere acknowledgement. It is an active engagement with truth. It is the realization that the believer is seated in heavenly authority, clothed in divine provision, and empowered by the Spirit to speak with effect. Jesus exemplified this in every act of prayer. He did not tremble before the sick, the storm, or the authorities of darkness. He recognized the Father's power, spoke from that recognition, and the results manifested immediately. Faith-filled recognition does not depend on circumstances. It depends on understanding the unchanging nature of God. It is not swayed by appearances, delayed answers, or opposition. This is why fear-filled pleading often fails to produce the breakthrough sought, while recognition rooted in faith aligns heaven with earth and releases divine power. The mechanism of prayer works on the principle of agreement. God has already spoken His will and established His promises. When the believer approaches in faith-filled recognition, they are declaring agreement with heaven rather than attempting to influence it. Fear, on the other hand, creates disagreement with truth. It signals to the mind and spirit that the one praying is unsure, unsteady, and disconnected from God's promises. Fear communicates limitation, faith communicates authority. Recognition communicates alignment, pleading communicates neediness. Jesus made it clear that effective prayer is born of alignment with God's truth, not the volume or repetition of words. Many believers fail to see results because they approach prayer with the wrong expectation. They hope God will act in response to their effort, repetition, or emotional intensity. They believe that persistence without certainty will eventually compel heaven to respond. Jesus corrected this assumption by demonstrating that God's action is consistent, certain, and aligned with His promises. Recognition of that truth releases the believer from uncertainty. When one prays with faith-filled recognition, the words themselves carry authority. There is no struggle to persuade. There is no anxiety to compensate for doubt. The believer speaks with certainty because they understand that the outcome is already established in principle through God's will. Fear-driven prayer often produces hesitation, repetition, and unnecessary elaboration. Believers feel compelled to justify their requests, provide explanations, or convince God of the need for intervention. These actions are unnecessary because God is not influenced by explanation or persuasion. Faith-filled recognition, in contrast, trusts that God knows, God sees, and God is already acting. It declares the truth of His promises without adding uncertainty or doubt. This is why Jesus emphasized the posture of faith over the practice of repetition. The heart that recognizes God's nature speaks with confidence, and heaven responds to that confidence rather than to anxiety. Jesus also highlighted that prayer is relational, not transactional. God is not a distant authority to be persuaded. He is a father who desires intimate engagement with his children. When believers pray from fear, they treat God as transactional, seeking outcomes through pressure rather than partnership. Faith-filled recognition restores the relational aspect of prayer. It acknowledges God as Father, the believer as child, and the Spirit as active presence. In this posture, words become declarations of truth and alignment, rather than attempts to manipulate or convince. Recognition replaces fear with boldness, hesitation with certainty, and pleading with confident expectation. Another reason fear-filled prayers fail is that they reflect internal doubt and lack of trust. Even if the words are repeated or articulated with passion, the underlying sentiment communicates uncertainty. Heaven responds not to emotion, but to faith. Recognition rooted in faith carries spiritual weight because it is congruent with truth. It does not beg, it declares. It does not question, it acknowledges. It does not hesitate, it stands firm. Jesus modeled this consistently. He never approached the Father with uncertainty, nor did he articulate needs with trembling. Instead, he prayed with assurance, declaring alignment with God's will and trusting the inherent power of that alignment to manifest results. Faith-filled recognition also transforms the believer internally. When one prays with certainty, understanding, and awareness of divine authority, fear diminishes and confidence grows. The mind is no longer consumed with worry or speculation about outcomes. The heart rests in the certainty of God's promises. The voice speaks with authority because the spirit is settled. This internal alignment amplifies the external effect of the prayer. Jesus' correction was aimed precisely at this principle. A settled heart produces words of power. An anxious heart produces words of weakness. Recognition of God's nature and promises ensures that the believer's words carry spiritual authority and open the way for breakthrough. The principle of faith-filled recognition also changes the believer's perception of answered prayer. Instead of approaching with uncertainty or doubt, the believer approaches with confidence that God is already acting. Fear-filled pleading waits and worries. Recognition declares and releases. The spiritual atmosphere shifts when a believer speaks with authority rooted in faith. The unseen realm responds to certainty, alignment, and declaration. Jesus' teachings on prayer emphasized this principle repeatedly, demonstrating that words spoken from recognition carry far more weight than words born of anxiety, repetition, or fear. Ultimately, the lesson is clear: fear limits prayer, recognition empowers it. Pleading produces uncertainty, faith produces authority. Hesitation signals doubt, declaration demonstrates confidence. Jesus taught that prayer is not about trying to persuade or convince God. It is about stepping into alignment with His will, acknowledging His promises, and speaking from a heart full of faith. When believers grasp this truth, prayer becomes a dynamic instrument of power, a channel for divine influence, and an expression of authority rather than a cry of desperation. Faith-filled recognition is the key that unlocks heaven's response, transforming words from mere sound into a force that moves mountains, heals the sick, and manifests the purposes of God. Prayer is not a ritual to be performed or a set of words to be repeated. It is a conversation, a communion, and a declaration of relationship between God and the believer. Right prayer flows naturally from relationship rather than ritual, and this distinction is at the heart of what Jesus revealed. Many people approach prayer as a series of actions to be completed: kneel, recite, petition, and wait. While these practices may carry cultural or personal significance, they often obscure the true purpose of prayer, which is not to perform but to connect. Ritual without relationship produces empty words, tired hearts, and frustrated spirits. Jesus made it clear that the effectiveness of prayer is rooted not in method, volume, or procedure, but in the depth of the believer's relationship with the Father. The heart that is aligned, attuned, and engaged with God speaks with authority, while the heart that performs mechanically produces little effect. When prayer becomes ritualistic, it risks becoming a habit divorced from faith. Believers may repeat phrases or gestures because they have always done so, or because they feel pressure to appear devout. These actions, while not inherently wrong, lack the power of relationship-driven prayer because the spirit behind them is not actively engaged. Jesus emphasized that God desires connection, not compulsion. True prayer arises from an intimate knowledge of the Father's character, a recognition of His promises, and a confidence in the believer's identity in Christ. Ritual may occupy time and effort, but without relationship, it cannot release the power of heaven. The words are hollow, the motions are empty, and the outcomes are limited because prayer is intended to be relational, not transactional. Ritual can also create a false sense of spirituality. A believer may feel pious or disciplined because they follow certain procedures, but the heart may be far from God. Jesus confronted this tendency, teaching that God looks beyond outward appearance to the inner condition of the heart. Relationship-driven prayer flows from faith, trust, and intimacy. It communicates alignment with God's will, acknowledgement of His promises, and confidence in His power. This kind of prayer is not concerned with impressing others or fulfilling expectations. It is a natural expression of connection, arising from the knowledge that God is near and listening. The believer's words are a reflection of the heart's relationship, not a checklist of spiritual obligations. Relationship-driven prayer transforms the believer's approach to God. Instead of seeing prayer as a requirement or a ritual, it becomes a moment of engagement, reflection, and declaration. The believer speaks not to inform God of their needs, but to align themselves with His presence and purposes. This mindset shifts the focus from effort to faith. Instead of repeating words in uncertainty, the believer declares truth, acknowledges God's authority, and enters into agreement with His promises. The power of such prayer is evident, because it springs from connection rather than obligation. Jesus modeled this consistently, demonstrating that His prayers were not mechanical or performative, but full of presence, authority, and intimacy with the Father. When ritual overshadows relationship, the spiritual life becomes routine and predictable. Prayer loses its freshness, its power, and its capacity to produce transformation. Jesus' teaching sought to restore the vitality of prayer by reminding believers that it is relational at its core. Words spoken in genuine connection carry authority. Words spoken as a habit carry little weight. The difference is profound. Relationship engages faith, trust, and identity, whereas ritual can disengage the spirit and reduce prayer to a task. Believers who understand this principle find that their prayers become more dynamic, effective, and life-giving because they arise from communion rather than repetition. Relationship-driven prayer also cultivates intimacy with God. It shifts the believer's perception from distance to nearness, from obligation to privilege, and from fear to confidence. When prayer is relational, the believer recognizes that God is not a distant judge, but a loving Father who desires conversation, connection, and alignment. Words are no longer directed at persuading God to act, but at participating in what He is already doing. This understanding transforms the energy behind prayer. It is no longer desperate or anxious, but confident and expectant. The believer speaks from alignment, trust, and awareness of divine authority. Jesus' teaching demonstrates that prayer's power is inseparable from relationship. The closer the connection, the greater the authority, clarity, and effectiveness of words spoken in faith. Ritual can also limit spiritual perception. When the focus is on correct formulas, structured sequences, or traditional methods, the believer may miss opportunities for spontaneous engagement with God. Relationship-driven prayer is flexible, dynamic, and responsive to the Spirit. It listens, recognizes, and declares, rather than simply reciting. This does not mean that structure or consistency is wrong, but it emphasizes that power resides in connection, not in method. Jesus' example illustrates that prayer is most effective when it flows naturally from awareness of God's presence and understanding of His character. The words are not bound by habit, they are empowered by intimacy. Faith and relationship are inseparable in prayer. A believer who approaches God with ritual alone may find their faith stagnant, their confidence weak, and their prayers unproductive. In contrast, when prayer is relational, faith is activated, trust is deepened, and the believer's identity in Christ is affirmed. This approach aligns the believer with God's purposes, releases spiritual authority, and produces tangible outcomes. The heart communicates certainty and assurance, and the words spoken carry the weight of authority, rather than mere petition. Jesus corrected the misdirection of ritual-based prayer to ensure that believers understand that the spirit behind the words determines their effectiveness, not the quantity, repetition, or external form. The posture of the heart is central to relationship-driven prayer. Fear, hesitation, and repetition often indicate that the heart is disconnected, whereas confidence, clarity, and alignment indicate engagement with God. Prayer that arises from relationship carries the energy of trust, the authority of identity, and the impact of faith. Jesus emphasized that heaven responds not to the length of the prayer or the precision of words, but to the authenticity of the connection. When the heart is aligned and the spirit is engaged, prayer becomes a channel for supernatural intervention, healing, provision, and transformation. Relationship-driven prayer also shifts the believer's mindset toward expectancy rather than desperation. Ritual-based prayer may focus on asking repeatedly for outcomes, reflecting uncertainty or lack of faith. In contrast, relational prayer focuses on agreement with God's promises, awareness of His presence, and confidence in His power. The words become declarations, acknowledgments, and alignments rather than attempts to manipulate or convince. This posture releases authority in prayer, ensures clarity of communication, and produces results consistent with divine will. Jesus' teaching reinforces that the measure of prayer's effectiveness is rooted in the relational engagement of the heart, not the mechanical repetition of words. Ultimately, the true power of prayer emerges when it is relational. The believer's heart, mind, and spirit are aligned with God's presence, promises, and authority. Words spoken from this place carry life, influence circumstances, and demonstrate the reality of divine engagement. Jesus revealed that ritual without relationship may occupy time, but it does not release heaven's power. Words without connection may sound impressive, but they lack authority. Prayer that flows from relationship, on the other hand, transforms situations, strengthens faith, and manifests God's will. It is not about procedure, it is about connection. It is not about obligation, it is about communion. It is not about repetition, it is about recognition and alignment with the Father.